In the shadows of the City of Angels lies a notorious criminal organization, the Los Angeles crime family, also known as the Dragna family or the L.A. Mafia. Once dubbed the Mickey Mouse Mafia by former LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, this Italian-American crime syndicate built its empire in Southern California as part of the broader American Mafia. Rising to power in the Prohibition era, the L.A. Mafia thrived under Jack Dragna in the 1940s and early 1950s, though it never rivaled the might of New York or Chicago's families. After Dragna's death in 1956, the family's influence waned, with the Chicago outfit representing them on the commission. Key insights into the L.A. Mafia come from courtroom testimonies and the biography of Aladina, Jimmy the Weasel Fratianno, a former boss who made history by turning state's witness against the Mafia in the late 1970s. With the rise of the RICO Act in the 1980s, Mafia power across the U.S., including in Los Angeles, began to crumble. The L.A. Mafia, once a force to be reckoned with, now clings to survival in a city dominated by multi-ethnic street gangs. Today, it stands as the last Mafia family in California, a fading relic of a bygone era. In the early days of organized crime in California, a power struggle brewed among various Italian street gangs, with the Black Hand organizations at the forefront. Among them, the most notorious was the Matranga family of Albanian Arborish descent, who had settled in southern Italy centuries before. Fronting as fruit vendors, the Matrangas used threats, violence, arson, and extortion to dominate the Plaza area, the heart of the Italian-American community in Los Angeles. Their leader, Rosario Sam Matranga, took control in 1905, with his relatives Salvatore, Pietro, and Antonio as key members of the gang. The turning point came in 1906 when Joseph Ardizone, a rival Black Hand leader, killed a Matranga associate after a dispute. Fleeing to avoid capture, Ardizone left the Matranga family to solidify their grip on the community. They worked closely with corrupt law enforcement, trading secrets for immunity, and building their criminal empire. Yet, Ardizone's return in 1914 reignited their violent feud. By 1917, both Sam and his successor, Pietro, were murdered, and the once dominant Matranga family began to crumble under the weight of this bloody conflict. Bootlegging in the 1920s only hastened their decline, and by 1930, the family had vanished, their power wiped out. Meanwhile, Vito DiGiorgio, a powerful Sicilian mobster, moved to Los Angeles from New Orleans, seizing the opportunity to bring some order to the chaotic underworld. DiGiorgio maintained close ties to mobsters in New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, but his reign ended abruptly when he was murdered during a haircut in 1922. His underboss, Rosario Di Simone, quietly took the reins, operating bootlegging rackets and maintaining influence behind the scenes. In the 1920s, another figure, Albert Marco, rose to power, not by working with the Mafia, but through the City Hall Gang, a political machine that controlled much of Los Angeles. Marco became the city's vice lord, amassing a fortune through prostitution, illegal gambling, and bootlegging. However, his empire crumbled when he was convicted of assault in 1928, sparking a violent scramble for control over the liquor trade. This ruthless power struggle claimed numerous lives, including Marco's former lieutenant, August Palumbo, and his successor, Dominic Brooklier, who met his end in 1931 after challenging the city's more powerful syndicates. These brutal early years laid the foundation for what would eventually become the Los Angeles crime family, a group forged in blood, betrayal, and relentless ambition. Joseph "Iron Man" Ardizone returned to California in 1914, acquitted of the Maisano murder a year later due to lack of evidence and witness intimidation. Back in power, Ardizone wasted no time expanding his influence over Los Angeles's underworld. He partnered with Jack Dragna, and for over a decade, they built a criminal empire, thriving on bootlegging, gambling, and extortion during Prohibition. By the late 1920s, Ardizone had consolidated power, battling rivals like Charlie Crawford for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. With the murders of Bucola and Di Ciala, Ardizone became the undisputed crime boss of L.A. He established the Italian Protective League, a supposed political and social organization that served mostly as muscle for the Mafia, with Dragna as president and Ardizone as vice president. But Ardizone's reign came to a mysterious end in 1931, when he vanished while en route to his cousin's house. His body was never found. Jack Dragna quickly filled the power vacuum, solidifying his position as the head of the L.A. Mafia. Dragna, though less charismatic than East Coast crime lords, became the most successful boss the L.A. crime family had ever seen. He brought the family onto the national stage by aligning with the National Mafia Syndicate and earning a seat on the commission, the only boss west of Chicago to do so. After Prohibition ended in 1933, Dragna shifted to loan sharking and illegal gambling, using his muscle to drive out competitors like Guy McAfee and Milton Farmer Page, and seizing control of LA's lucrative gambling rackets. What set Dragna apart from other mafia bosses was his sophisticated approach to extortion. Rather than merely threatening businesses, Dragna's men would first intimidate a business, then offer protection against the very threats they orchestrated. It was a clever twist on the traditional protection racket, ensuring businesses paid up without knowing Dragna's own men were behind the threats. Despite his success, Dragna struggled to control 100% of the independent gambling operations in Los Angeles and was often seen as a shadowy figure who avoided the limelight, unlike more flamboyant East Coast bosses. Despite this perception, Dragna's organization was far from weak. He recruited key figures from across the country, such as Johnny Rosselli from Chicago, Nick Licata from Detroit, and Jimmy the Weasel Fratianno from Cleveland. These men, along with top hitman Frank Bompensiero, turned the L.A. Mafia into a formidable force, extending their reach across California and into southern Nevada. Their influence even crept into the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, known for being more corrupt than the city's police force, but Dragna's power had its limits. When New York's Lucky Luciano sent Benjamin Bugsy Siegel to Los Angeles, tensions between the two began to simmer. Siegel, who was sent to establish a horse racing wire service on the West Coast, made millions by extorting movie production companies, forcing Dragna to play second fiddle in his own city. Though Siegel paid tribute to Dragna for operating on his turf, the dynamic between them was uneasy. With New York backing Siegel, Dragna found himself boxed in, particularly as Siegel infiltrated labor unions in Hollywood, a racket Dragna couldn't penetrate as deeply. Together, Dragna and Siegel tried to take control of Continental Press Service, the dominant horse racing wire service. When intimidation and buyout offers failed, they created their own company, Transamerica, only for the Chicago outfit to swoop in and take over Continental Press, giving Dragna control of the West Coast wire service. This power move infuriated Siegel, straining their partnership further. As Jack Dragna's empire flourished, the seeds of conflict were sown. Though he held power, cracks were beginning to show in LA's underworld, as outside forces like Siegel and East Coast Mafia bosses chipped away at his dominance. What would happen next would shift the landscape of organized crime on the West Coast forever. Once Bugsy Siegel fell out of favor with New York, his fate was sealed. Though his murder remains officially unsolved, it's widely believed that Jack Dragna's men were given the order to kill him. After Siegel's death, his lieutenant, Mickey Cohen, took over the gambling and loan shark operations in Los Angeles. However, Cohen wasn't one to fall in line. Instead, he started building his own crime family, quickly becoming a rival to Dragna. Sensing an opportunity to eliminate Cohen, Dragna first tried to undermine him by recruiting some of Cohen's Italian associates, like Dominic Brooklier. Then, he targeted Cohen's key men, David Ogle, Frank Nicoli, Nettie Herbert, and Harold Hookie Rothman. All were killed under mysterious circumstances. But, in what seemed like pure luck, Cohen survived several assassination attempts, leading John Rosselli to famously compare him to Chicago's Bugs Moran. In 1951, Cohen's luck ran out, at least temporarily, when he was imprisoned for tax evasion. With Cohen out of the picture, Dragna's family swooped in to take control of his lucrative gambling operations. By the late 1930s, the West Coast was becoming more volatile, with high-profile murders and increasing mafia influence. This, along with the corruption scandal that led to the recall of Mayor Frank L. Shaw, forced law enforcement to turn against the mafia. California's Attorney General Earl Warren, future Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, launched an aggressive assault on Dragna's empire, including shutting down Anthony Cornero's offshore gambling ships. By 1950, the California Commission on Organized Crime had officially identified Dragna as the head of a Southern California crime syndicate. Things began to unravel quickly. Several of Dragna's family members were arrested in connection to the bombing of Mickey Cohen's home. Dragna himself fled the state, but eventually surrendered for questioning. During the notorious Kefauver hearings on organized crime, Dragna, along with Rosselli and Frank Bompensiero, denied all accusations. Despite these efforts, the tide had shifted. By the early 1950s, while mafia families in the East thrived, the L.A. crime family was starting its slow decline. In 1950, William H. Parker became chief of the LAPD, marking a new era of aggressive crackdowns on organized crime. With police pressure mounting and the infamous Gangster Squad targeting both Dragna's and Cohen's operations, the family began losing ground to stronger syndicates from Chicago and New York. By the mid-1950s, key players were facing serious consequences. Frank Bompensiero and Jimmy Fratianno both served prison time in 1953 and 1954. Then, in 1956, Jack Dragna died of a heart attack. His death signaled a turning point for the L.A. Mafia. Johnny Rosselli seemed the obvious successor, but the family surprisingly elected Frank DeSimone, a lawyer-turned-gangster, to be its new boss. Rosselli, frustrated and feeling the election had been rigged, left the family and returned to the Chicago outfit. Under DeSimone's leadership, the family spiraled into chaos. He was seen as a weak and ineffective boss. His reputation was further tarnished by a scandal in which he allegedly raped the wife of former underboss Girolamo Momo Gadamo. This led Adamo to attempt a murder-suicide with his wife, which only resulted in his own death. DeSimone's leadership continued to falter, and he embarrassed the family further by being outed as a mobster during the Appalachian Meeting raid. His underboss, Simone Scazzari, was soon deported to Italy, leaving DeSimone isolated. By the 1960s, the L.A. crime family had dwindled in power. It was estimated that only about 30 active members were still operating in Los Angeles, though the family maintained a stronger presence in San Diego. DeSimone's paranoia grew after he narrowly escaped an assassination plot orchestrated by Joseph Bonanno, who saw him as a liability. DeSimone's reign ended in 1967 when he died, leaving the family in disarray. Nick Old Man Licata took over after DeSimone's death. Licata had strong connections to other mafia families in the Midwest and South and maintained ties with the Las Vegas underworld. But by then, the authorities had the L.A. family firmly in their sights. In 1967, hitman Frank Bompensiero turned informant, severely damaging the family from within. This followed Joe Valachi's 1963 testimony, which had already revealed the mafia's secret inner workings and identified Licata as a key figure in L.A. Despite the heat, there was one bright spot for the family: Louis Tom Dragna's company, Roberta Dress Manufacturing. Thanks to Jack Dragna's earlier efforts to bring in New York labor expert Johnny Dio, Louis managed to turn the company into a $10 million a year business by manipulating labor unions in L.A.'s garment district. Licata hoped to revive the family, but constant surveillance from the FBI and LAPD crippled his efforts. In 1969, he was held in contempt of court for refusing to testify about the mafia's operations and spent 6 months in prison. The family took further hits in the 1970s, with members facing indictment for gambling, racketeering, and extortion charges. When key witness John Dubček was murdered in Las Vegas, it scared off other informants, but several gangsters were still convicted, albeit with light sentences. Licata's trusted underboss, Joseph DiPolito, was expected to succeed him, but DiPolito died of a heart attack in 1974. By the time Licata himself passed away later that year, the L.A. crime family was a shadow of its former self. Under the leadership of Dominic Brooklier, the Los Angeles crime family briefly found stability. Brooklier managed to make substantial money in pornography, extortion, and drug trafficking. However, despite his successes, he struggled to regain control over independent bookmaking rackets in L.A. that had slipped away from the family. His criminal reach into the lucrative pornography industry involved shaking down producers, who would then pay off their mafia backers on the East Coast to keep the peace with the LA mob. The East Coast backers would secretly split the profits with Brooklier's crew, keeping the money flowing. As Brooklier solidified his hold on the family, he ordered the hit on Frank Bompensiero, a veteran mobster who had grown increasingly critical of the leadership. Worse yet, Brooklier found out that Bompensiero was cooperating with the FBI. In 1975, Brooklier and his underboss, Samuel Ciartino, were sentenced to 20 months in prison. This power vacuum allowed Jimmy Fratianno, with backing from Tom Dragna, to step in as co-acting boss alongside Dragna. Fratianno used this opportunity to travel across the country, establishing connections and trying to restore the LA family's tarnished reputation. Fratianno's ambition was clear. He hoped to be the family's official boss when Brooklier was released. However, Brooklier wasted no time taking back control of the family once he was out of prison, demoting Fratianno back to a soldier. The true downfall of the Los Angeles Mafia began when Fratianno became a government witness, the second high-ranking mobster in American history to do so. His decision was triggered by his indictment in connection with the car bomb murder of Danny Green in Ohio. Fearing for his life, Fratianno cut a deal with the FBI, pleading guilty to murder-related charges and agreeing to testify against mafia figures across the country. His cooperation crippled the LA family and led to the convictions of several high-profile mobsters. Even though Brooklier had ordered a hit on Fratianno, suspecting him of trying to usurp his power, it was too late. The damage had been done. In 1981, Brooklier, Ciartino, and other members of the family were sentenced for racketeering and extortion, but they received surprisingly light sentences, 2 to 5 years. Brooklier continued to run the family from prison until his death in 1984 from a heart attack. Upon Brooklier's death, Peter Milano stepped in as boss, officially taking control in 1984. With his brother Carmen Flipper Milano as underboss, Peter rejuvenated the LA Mafia, focusing heavily on narcotics, pornography, gambling, and loan sharking. Under his leadership, the family inducted new members, including Steve the Whale Chino, singer Charles, Bobby Milano Cacci, and others. With a revitalized crew, Milano succeeded in collecting mob taxes from nearly every bookie in Los Angeles. The family's influence even extended into Las Vegas, a long-time mafia stronghold. However, the family's success was short-lived. In the late 1980s, law enforcement struck hard, arresting much of the family's leadership, including the Milano brothers, Mike Rizzitello and Jimmy Cacci, thanks in part to information provided by informants like the Fiato brothers. Rizzitello was later sentenced to 33 years for attempted murder, while Peter Milano received a 6-year sentence and Carmen 6 months after pleading guilty to lesser charges. After Peter Milano's release from prison in 1991, he resumed control of the weakened family. Despite its diminished power, the family made moves into Las Vegas, forging alliances with the Buffalo crime family. In 1997, the murder of Chicago outfit Associate Herbert, Fat Herbie, Blitzstein by L.A., and Buffalo mobsters marked a desperate attempt to seize control of Blitzstein's lucrative loan sharking and auto insurance fraud operations. The murder brought the full force of the FBI down on both families, resulting in the convictions of key figures like Steven Chino and Alfred Moriello, which further crippled the L.A. family. By the 1990s, the Los Angeles crime family had dwindled to an estimated 20 members, many of whom were largely ineffective. As the mafia lost its grip, street gangs, especially Mexican and African-American gangs, rose to prominence, dominating the criminal landscape in Southern California. Law enforcement shifted its focus to these groups, leaving the weakened mafia to fade into the background. In the 2000s and beyond, the Los Angeles family's presence all but disappeared. Although Peter Milano was still believed to be the boss until his death, his involvement in criminal activities had greatly diminished. Other key members either died, moved out of state, or retired from the life. Without a strong Italian-American community to draw recruits from, and faced with powerful competition from local street gangs, the LA Mafia was all but extinct. In a strange twist, since 2012, Tommaso "Tommy" Gambino, a Prosecco magnate based in Los Angeles and son of Rosario Gambino, has been rumored to lead what's left of the family. Informants have claimed that Gambino inducted Canadian gangster Albert Iavarone into the family just before Iavarone was murdered in 2018. Iavarone's death sparked tensions between the Buffalo and LA families, as he was supposed to be the new liaison between the Canadian Mafia and their American counterparts. This brief revival of Mafia intrigue was quickly overshadowed by the growing influence of street gangs and other criminal organizations, leaving the once powerful LA Mafia as a fading memory of its former self. Thanks for sticking with us on this journey inside the secret world of Mafia Titans. You're now part of an exclusive group with a front row seat to the untold stories of organized crime's most notorious figures. And the best part, it's all free. But we're not done yet. Our next episode will connect the dots, revealing how the rise and fall of the Los Angeles Mafia shaped the underworld as we know it. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned, because the Real story is just getting started.